Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is another week full of striking contrast, ethereal bliss, and atmosphere juxtaposed with some elements set to break it all down in so many ways. It's also one of those weeks that I don't pretend is going to get that much traction because A, I'm late, but also because I'm in the mode to cover more from my backlog, so let's get on the pulse. So we got 8 albums on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about, from Blackwinterwells, seraph.
I wanna be near you, but you're turning see-through. I won't give up. I'm starting to wither. I'm cold but don't shiver. I wish you were with her, but you're with me.
So I'm not going to say I'm an expert by any means in the extremely online hyperpop / bedroom pop / cloud rap / genre pile-up scenes. For me, it's more just keeping my ears on what's coming out and trying to find the material that eventually resonates with me outside of the snippets. So on that journey, we now have Blackwinterwells, with this project from earlier in the year that a patron requested, and ignoring some of that weird Twitter drama from a couple weeks ago, what did we get with this album? Well, honestly, I do hear why Blackwinterwells has gotten so much attention, because there is something to this. Blending in cloud rap with emo content, that's nothing new online, but this leans a lot more heavily on the misty, borderline Owl City shimmering textures and slightly askew melodies than the driving trap percussion grooves. So it serves as a sharper contrast to the content that feels a lot more blunt in the self-destructive relationships and the painful isolation. Honestly, it's so damn pretty that it's kind of easy to ignore how the melodramatic poetry that's leaning way too hard on the religious symbolism can start running together pretty fast, to the point where it's honestly a bit one note in the blissed out juxtaposition. And you know, that can happen with music that is this airy. If you're not gripped by more of the foundation points, which for me coalesce the best on 4ACO, it's just gonna wash over you and feel pleasant, but maybe not last all that long, especially given how short this is and how it kind of loses steam on the back half. So for me, strong 6 out of 10. It's gonna work for its target audience, but it's a bit insubstantial, might not last. Next up, from Bagdadski Vor, Colchida. So we're going back a bit with this one. A Russian screamo act dabbling in some math rock and post-hardcore, but not to the point where it actively detracts from structuring a competent melody or even a hook. In fact, this is gonna sound crazy coming from me, but for an album entirely in Russian with screamed vocals and the occasional math rock guitar switch up and flourish, this might be one of the most openly welcoming and bright sounding rock albums I have heard all of 2020. This is an album that could well serve as an entry point into these subgenres, even beyond the language barrier. It's got that catchiness. The lead work is extremely well balanced. The groove sections, they're complex, but not to the point where they actively detract from that central melody. And while the drum work is kind of wild and crashing, it ultimately is complementary to that groove. It doesn't overwhelm the song. Hell, some of the major key passages, they would not be out of place in the heavier sides of pop punk, even if the tones or distortion lean a little bit closer to the rougher jangle of shoegaze, and that's a great texture. But it also produces a similar balance that I like in my black metal, between the soaring shimmer and the thunderous royal, just this time in a compact 25-minute package that wastes none of your time, and I really respect how many hooks they crammed in here. Now, admittedly, I was concerned before I translated the lyrics, because I hoped this was not going to go awry, and again, I'm not working off a great translation, but a lot of what I found was pretty damn compelling. Breakups that are captured in abstract dreams, doomed hookups that are still being chased in firelit nights. And on the song with the translated title, Pied Piper, what might be a sly political message against authoritarian strongmen who promise that they're gonna fix everything, and all the blinkered masses who might buy into it. telling. Hell, there's an undercurrent of revolutionary joy to a lot of the writing that gets that the fight is going to be exhausting and lonely and death is inevitable, but that spark of life to be created from death and lived along the way, actually find that fire and joy in life, especially in unseating the old and corrupted ways to look forward. You know what, coming from Russia, those are some interesting and provocative themes that I'm a little bit surprised haven't received more attention, because it says something there. And you know what, from beyond that, look, I will freely admit that I can struggle to find a connection to projects that are in different languages like this, but I think the hooks on this, the album soars and burns so brightly, it blew through all of it, and it might be one of the best I've heard all year. Light 9 out of 10, not a bad moment on it. It's gonna be overlooked by a lot of people, even I'm getting to this late, but it's truly something special. Check it out. Next up from Lorn, The Map. So we've actually got two quasi-industrial instrumental albums that I want to go through here, and even if you don't recognize the name of this act, I bet a lot more of you recognize this guy than you might think. Lorn is an electronic producer, has been active throughout the 2010s. He was originally on Flying Lotus's Brain Feeder label, and then he went even more indie, but where I reckon more of you might recognize his sound is from the Killzone Shadow Fall soundtrack, which he produced entirely in 2014, as well as having a fair bit of his music show up in a couple movies and TV shows like CSI and Silicon Valley. So if you're into a brand of polished but kind of murky and gurgling industrial with even some smatterings of dubstep in his early work, you know what, that might be up your alley. But in recent years, he slid more towards dark ambient music. And with this EP, which is more of a collection of singles before he puts out that full length at some point, it was promised for this year, but I don't know. And you know what, all that backstory probably feels a fair bit more interesting than these three songs are. I gotta be blunt, outside of some impressive sound design and in terms of mix depth and texture, I did not get much out of this at all. Most because Lorn's work in the past couple of years, it has felt increasingly directionless, and that the jagged synths, they're more buzzing presence than actual tune, with little in the way of build-ups or crescendos or hooks. Now, you know what, that might be able to work if the textures or progressions that we did get were more unique, but outside of how much the bass can just swamp out the mixes and maybe an okay groove every now and then, the dour melodic progressions there aren't nearly as experimental or thought-provoking in their weirdness. They almost kind of feel obligation, the weird turns, with the compositions just kind of fizzling out when they run out of more ideas, and a lot of these ideas are stuff that Arca didn't do better 6 years ago. In other words, you know what, maybe I've just been spoiled by the cream of the crop when it comes to a lot of experimental electronic music, or just simply finding more stuff I like there, but this felt very rote and very forgettable. Strong 5 out of 10, take it or leave it. Next up from Dead Meat, The End of Their World is Coming. And here's the second one, and again, this might be a bit more familiar than you might realize, because Dead Meat is the side project of Algiers member Ryan Mahan, on a debut that pulls on much of the same textured, organic, but cavernous bleakness that drives Algiers' unique production. And in a way, it's expanding much of the palette in the same way the group was, touching on There Was No Year. Horn-inflected, free jazz digressions, they're now interweaving with the blown-out, blaring synths, the fractured vocal samples, what few we get, the sounds of cocking guns and shuddering, trap-infused lockstep percussion. These are mixes that are built more to reinforce some overwhelming dread, wailing klaxons, suffocating noise. Maybe to a fault, as you could probably argue that this becomes such a pulse-pounding experience throughout the entire album that it doesn't quite showcase much in the way of variation of mood outside of the tempos and various degrees of snarled howling echoing across the mix. But that sort of haunted, implacable dread at a coming revolution that's flagrantly anti-capitalist and likely very bloody, the project certainly captures a lot of that mood, I will give them that. But I don't know if the album captures the sense of liberatory joy that I've heard across similar projects in this lane from acts like Seeming or Special Interest, or hell, even that Bagdadski Vor album, even if this might promise a much more grisly and visceral picture. Not for the first time I wondered what Algiers frontman Franklin James Fisher might bring to some of these instrumentals beyond the mantra of the title track. Most of them have a lot of the intensity and the personality to stand alone, I will highlight that, but looking beyond that gurgling howl of intensity, I did find myself hunting for a little bit more dimension, or maybe just consistently stronger grooves, like on A Prayer Couldn't Hang Their Heads Lower. As such, you know what? It's a light 7 out of 10 for me. If you're into this brand of suffocatingly dark, instrumental, industrial post-punk, I think you'll dig this a lot, so it's worth hearing. Check it out. Next up from BENEE, Hey You X.
Cause what if they happen to me?
Am I the only one a little bit surprised that we're only getting the BENEE debut album now, seemingly months after Super Lonely blew up with its defiantly Gen Z embrace of irony and genre-blurring pop? It was the sort of song that did reflect a strident new voice, coming in a similar wake as Billie Eilish, but admittedly one that took a while for me to fully appreciate beyond the sneaking suspicion, why does this remind me way too much of Lily Allen? And sure enough, Lily Allen features on this debut album, and it's kind of impossible to ignore some of the parallels across the board in a very 2000s past the event horizon of irony that a certain generation of critics just adored in that time, and that I really couldn't stand. It ties into my general frustration with art that's playing on levels of irony that I mentioned when I covered Bia Badoobie a couple weeks ago. And while some of it is absolutely a generational thing, I get it, I think the larger factor is that it manufactures a level of deflection that can be very hit and miss in its delivery, almost entirely reliant on said delivery. Now for Lily Allen, while some found it charming, I found it sour, navel-gazing, and frequently insufferable, with the genre blending rarely able to back it up well, something that I mentioned in my reviews of her work, to a response that was just as charming, but thankfully I don't really feel that same aversion with BENEE, mostly because she feels a little bit more scattered and rough around the edges, and there's a bit more of an organic core to a lot of her angst. Part of this is how, despite the same genre pile-up for a lot of the album, scanning from bedroom pop to guitar-backed hazy dream pop, to even some tighter electronics and dance grooves like on Sheesh, it's not a project that ever tries to convincingly project her own coolness. Or when she tries it like on Super Lonely or the Kiss Off of Plane, it clearly comes across as a sad joke. Hell, there's a song called Cool where she outright admits she can't even play that game if she tried. And you know what? There's enough genuine sad wistfulness leaking through on the opening 2 songs that introduces that emotional core very early on, gives us that foundation point, helps us ground that relatability, and it feels surprisingly consistent. I mean, it's just kind of a shame that as the album continues, the production gets considerably less organic and more openly fractured as some of that deflection thickens with every layer of auto-tune and pitch shifting and burbling percussion that feels increasingly inorganic. But by the back half, it's discarded for some more low-key, earnest moments that might feel a bit simplistic or maybe even childlike in trying to find moments of trust or escape or freedom from deeply held fears and anxiety. But by that point, they do feel earned, especially by the closer, which I really liked. There's also a loose breakup arc on the album and discovery of new love, even if she's just creating it in her mind. But by the end, the project is more about her own growth and finding security in herself and what she wants. And again, See You is a great low-key closer and anchors the sweetness of it all and her self-actualization. But overall, I'm not gonna say you haven't heard this debut before, but it's sweet and charming where it needs to be. And the more I thought about it, the more I really liked it. So, light 7 out of 10. This is good stuff. Will probably go overlooked. Check it out. Next up from Amaarae, The Angel You Don't Know. I'll be honest, this is one of those cases with an artist where I'm not sure which lens is appropriate to analyze the content. For one, Amaarae's approach to R&B is very influenced by Afrobeat, specifically from her native Ghana, but there's also something to her sound that feels very much analogous to that very online genre pile-up feel of certain pop music, a lot of which we've already talked about this week. So its textures and content feel much more wide-ranging and colorful. She put out a pretty well-received EP in 2017, so now with this album getting a lot of critical acclaim, I wanted to make the executive decision, put this on my schedule, give it a listen, and I'm honestly a bit conflicted. On the one hand, it absolutely makes a ton of sense why critics like or outright love this album, because it's a sort of effortlessly poised, ethereal but textured trap R&B that's got some deceptive edge in its pictures of dancing, partying, and fucking a bit too hard. I'd almost say there's a bit of a Miguel feel to this album, and the blissed out but very organic vibe. Just how damn effectively that Amaarae can create that sense of thick atmosphere where her guests serve more as figures drifting in and out of her stories in this party. Some blurring of genres off of a lot of smoky guitar. But Amaarae, she's also much more likely to throw in some sharper curveballs, a little bit more rock distortionate spots, along with much more developed Afrobeat rhythms that are interwoven in some of the bassy trap grooves. It is effortlessly cool. I've seen some critics cite certain moments on the project as parodying parts of the scene, but it really feels way too secure in its own expansive vibe to take potshots, and the moments that do feel more earnest, they actually do feel realized. They're snapshots of intimacy. And in a different time, I could really see so much of this becoming staples in all too many upscale, swanky downtown nightclubs for warm nights, and thus, me feeling lukewarm on it kind of leaves me out in the cold here. It's not even that I take issue with how a lot of the content doesn't show a ton of dimensionality, or how it can leave Amaarae as a bit of a cipher or a chameleon in some of the vibes that she tries to cultivate, but my central issue, it's her vocal delivery. I've said before that the chipmunk vocals or bad falsetto can just hit the uncanny valley for me, and Amaarae's baby voice cooing is really damn close to that territory, even before you drop in the auto-tune on top of it or some of her guest stars that emulate it. For an album that is otherwise so effortlessly sexy, this delivery just does not work for me whatsoever when it's trying to, even if it's husky and very well placed in the mix. It adds to the generally ephemeral feel of the album. A lot of color that will paint the cool nights, but without the body to really stick with me and make it a great night. So look, I absolutely get why this album's getting a ton of acclaim. If you're looking just to set the vibe, this will do it, and I respect it for it. I just wish I liked it more. 6 out of 10, but if what I described is more your thing, you'll probably love it. So give it a chance. Next up from Aesop Rock, Spirit World Field Guide.
Standing on both sides of that tough love. They're both mud, that's what's up. That's what's up. That's what's up. Straight up and down, won't even I was at the gates.
It makes way too much sense that this is the Aesop Rock album we're getting in 2020, which many are hailing as one of his brightest and most accessible albums to date, and again, for an abstract, somewhat paranoid and pessimistic loner lurking around the fringe, I can see why some people have finally found more kinship with Aesop Rock in 2020. Even if the content still requires a lot of time to get your head around. Time that folks now have, so again, I get it. Maybe that's why Aesop Rock feels so comfortable over some of his most bright and eccentric production to date. He has been prepping for this sort of apocalyptic calamity for years now, especially one that's leaving him stuck inside with a gamer's instincts, an overactive imagination, and an old school punk mindset to scavenge and be prepared however you can as capitalism decays around you, or really just society. But also, that'd just be too easy for Aesop Rock, because midway through the album, you get the impression that Aesop Rock is looking to find his own spiritual renewal on this trip, partially referencing a trip he took to Peru and one to Southeast Asia, and into the Amazon as a moment that sparked his imagination, and even sought to puncture some of his pessimism. They whispered something to me that I will bear unto my coffin What's apparent via Occam is despondency as common. And that actually gives the album something of an arc. An outcast survivor like him could easily do it all alone, or he could succumb to his own distrustful nihilism, especially when he's inclined to let all the odd spirits and live wild for better or for worse. But that can also lead to its own form of warped decay, either in his surroundings or his own increasing humanity and age, most starkly seen when the scenes crash back to Earth on the shorter tracks, and he's stuck dealing with fruit flies and back pain, or he takes a detour to go skating over a 6/4 time signature on an instrumental on a song that's literally called Side Quest. And while he walks that lonely road, the only one he's ever known, and one that he's gonna go until he sees red, the advice that he passes along the way shows the very steep consequences that path has laid on himself. I appreciate that self-awareness, but also given the natural ending of death not really having much greater significance to his experience, painting the odd journey in such vibrant colors has value in and of itself. Meaning of life is to give life meaning, as it is. And so, of course, like any Aesop Rock album, it is quotable for days and frequently hilarious. He paints pictures with such vibrant and tactile detail, this time with the easy excuse to play with even more references to demonology and oddball fantasy, and an eye for animal behavior. And while I don't quite think it's as accessible in some of the storytelling as The Impossible Kid was, this album is all about that wondrous journey where the wordplay paints with as much texture, both internal and external. And that safari might be a pretty damn great one, although not without its flaws. To the surprise of nobody, the album can feel both long and pretty meandering. And while, of course, it's the point, and I'd argue the production is more consistent in the spikes of guitar, the scratching, the caked-over percussion, and the off-key spurts of keyboard, a lot of the sharp clarity of it all makes me wish that there was a little bit more focus on blending Aesop Rock's voice into more of these mixes. I had this issue on The Impossible Kid too. It often feels like he's rapping on top of these beats rather than within them, and that doesn't quite help the atmosphere and verisimilitude, especially when the instrumentals are so inviting in order to fit him into that. And on another note, I'm not sure the standouts of this album can really match up with his best. There isn't a Blood Sandwich or Acid King that really nails the human drama in the same way, of which I do think he knows, as he's plenty comfortable writing himself into his own abstract corner. Again, he references it. But for an album that is all about that journey, it leaves me looking for some of the sharper moments that will elevate the whole. And while we will get a fair few of them in the instrumentals, like the demented quirk of the organs on At the Gates and Sleeper Car, the spiky space rock of Button Masher, the bassy, buzzy warbles of Holy Waterfall, the impressive bleakness of Fixed and Dilated that still had a pretty good hook, the propulsive buildup of Marble Cake, and a lot of the haunted wisps and scratching of Salt and Kobakushi, they might be some of the best blended songs on the album, and I'll give them credit for that, but there aren't as many standouts. I listed a lot there, but that's also because the album is 21 songs. So, okay, it's better than Malibu Ken, even if you can tell that Aesop Rock has taken a couple cues from Tobacco in the keyboard choices and loops, but it's still not quite his best, so solid 8 out of 10. Definitely an eccentric journey, one worth taking, so you should check it out. And finally, from Chris Stapleton, Starting Over.
Be my four-leaf clover, starting over.
No mincing words, I had no idea where Chris Stapleton was going to go with this album. Now, very much established with that mainstream presence that even Nashville radio can't ignore fully, I had no clue where he was going to take his sound after the extremely stripped back From A Room EPs that were from 3 years ago. Dave Cobb was still producing, so I expected it was going to sound great, but Chris Stapleton's music is usually pretty textured and intriguing, and where I found the most potency in recent years from him has often come in the writing. And again, it feels like indie country hasn't so much left Chris Stapleton behind so much as expanded its breadth and timbres beyond his breakthrough moments, which is worth noting given all the hype behind this. And you know, the more listens I gave to Starting Over, the more I had the feeling that it was pleasant, it was very solid, and in patches it was taking those extra steps in order to stick the landing, but maybe not quite far enough, and certainly not to the degree of the best country music that's dropped in 2020. Yes, it's nice to realize that Dave Cobb's production and layering finally has that sense of detail and warmth that was missing from the previous Chris Stapleton albums, like how the strings will slip in behind Cold and sound really good opposite the piano, or how supple and love-struck Joy of My Life feels, and also more proof he finally knows what to do with a bass line when it's integral to the composition, like on Hillbilly Blood, which, I mean, the bass should always be there all the time, but baby steps, I guess, with him. And you know what? Nobody can deny that Chris Stapleton has one of the most distinctive hollers that's currently working in country of any stripe, Nashville or indie. It's why when he recorded The Devil Always Made Me Think Twice after letting Hayley Witters have it earlier this year, he gives that song that bluesy growl that it probably really needed. I think his version's a bit better, but here's the strange thing. Chris Stapleton has been working as a songwriter for hire in Nashville for so long that I'm pretty familiar with the cadence and structure of his tunes when he's writing for other people. Not to the point of cliche, but where when I get to his album, I'm looking for what he saved for himself to deliver a more strikingly unique project, and again, it's kind of patchy. I mean, Starting Over is an excellent opener, even if it's no Broken Halos. Maggie's song is about as good of a tribute to his dog who passed away as you'll probably get. You Should Probably Leave is a surprisingly mature flirtation where she's always on the cusp of heading out, and it's really kind of nicely done. Nashville, Tennessee, it's a great swan song from an industry lifer. It leaves you wondering where the hell he's gonna go, as that's the closer. And Watch You Burn is a sort of fire and brimstone stomper against mass shooters that was both a welcome surprise and easily the heaviest cut here. But let's be real, was the Guy Clark cover of Worry Be Gone really all that essential? Especially when he was also going to cover Old Friends right after it in the track list? And to round things off, I'm not wild about the sequencing here either. Outside of the opener and the closer, this album's flow can be a little jerky, kind of haphazard, which makes it feel longer than it is. And this has been a Chris Stapleton issue for a while now. It was one of my big issues of Traveler. That being said, there's not a bad song on this project, and I recognize my criticisms come from somebody who has really high expectations for Chris Stapleton. I think he's got it in him to make his version of Jamie Johnson's The Guitar Song, and it kind of bugs me he's not quite there yet, but there's enough obvious greatness, and this album is so easy to like, so very light 8 out of 10. I get why it's gotten so much of acclaim. It does deserve it. It's worth hearing. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Apologies for the lateness here. I got tied up with some other things and some other collaborations that you should definitely go check out on some of my friends' channels. Think Rocked and Crash Thompson. It's a lot of fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you'd like to like and subscribe, again, I would be grateful for that. And if you have comments on surely I said something that offended you, enjoy down the comments down there. It's a lot of fun. And beyond that, if you want to get involved in my schedule before the end of this year, or hell, you want to join my own Discord community, which I currently am running and mostly curating, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, if you can't contribute at this time, I understand, it's tough times, do not feel any obligation, but if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.